Circumcised men, what happens if you don't clean under the extra skin? This happened around 6 years ago when I was in 9th grade. I grew up not knowing a single thing about my schlong or how to clean it. My parents never taught me anything about genitals and I apparently never asked. All I knew was that's where the pee came out. So one day in 9th grade biology our teacher was covering the male reproductive system that day and she mentioned that for uncircumcised men, the foreskin is supposed to retract over the head. I was pretty shocked because that's certainly not how mine worked. By that time I was a daily meat beater and my foreskin could barely go back enough for me to see the entrance of the urethra. So armed with my new knowledge about how my sausage was supposed to work I went home and a few Google searches led me to discover that I had a severe case of phimosis, or tight foreskin. So being the pragmatic young buck that I am I also Google how to fix it. There were basically two options. Either tell my parents and have them take me to a doctor for surgery or do stretching exercises. Not wanting to tell any of this to my parents or have someone come near my member with a scalpel I opted for the latter option. I got some baby oil, the only lube available at the time, and went to work. After about 4 hours of stretching I finally started making some progress. I could see a slightly bigger area now, not just the opening of the urethra like before. Everything was going great except for one thing. From the underside of my foreskin came the most pungent, musty, cheesy disgusting smell I've ever had the displeasure of smelling even to this day. It dawned on me that my schlong had truly not been cleaned at all in my entire life up to that point. I kept stretching over the course of a few days and I started to notice a thick, gooey greenish-brown sludge seeping from under the foreskin as I stretched. Some quick Googling taught me that this was smegma, also known as cheese. I cleaned it off whenever it seeped out during my stretching exercises and as much as it disgusted me everything was still going fine. That was about to change real fast. So this was about 10 days into my stretching and I'd gotten my foreskin about to the halfway mark. I was getting very excited to finally have a normal full functioning sausage so I got very impatient and I decided I'd try to force it all the way back. That day I lubed and got to work. I pulled it back as far as it would go and pulled it some more. I pulled it till I couldn't bear the pain anymore. I did this over and over again for 3 hours until I somehow managed to pull it almost to where it was almost over the entirety of the head of my schlong. I got way too excited and despite the pain I gave it one big yank and I felt the foreskin pop over the back of the glands. It hurt like hell but I was just so relieved that I didn't care. I opened my eyes and my heart skipped several beats. The entire lower half of the head down to the area behind it was caked with thick brown and green smegma. The smegma was now mixing with the blood from where I tore the top part of my foreskin when I yanked it over the glands. I freaked and squeezed the area to stop the bleeding and that only made the pain worse. It eventually stopped and then I had to chip away at the smegma caked onto my sausage. I eventually got it all off after half an hour of scrubbing. I was still hurting but I was finally done. I thought that was it. I tried rolling the foreskin back over the head but it wouldn't budge so I just left it. I completely ignored the fact that leaving the foreskin back all the way would constrict all the blood flow to the head. You know how a balloon looks when you fill it with water and tie it? That's how my schlong looked. I went to bed, went to school the next day in severe pain and acted like everything was fine. When I got home I was still in major pain so I decided I'd check on it. I undressed in the shower and looked down at it. The first thing I saw were the blisters. 2 huge brown pus-filled blisters, one on the right side and the other on the underside of the glands. The next thing I noticed was the fact that my schlong was now seemingly turning some shade of white. I'm a black guy. I realized that if I didn't find a way to get my foreskin back over my glands then it was probably going to shrivel up and fall off. I lubed up once more and began forcing my foreskin back over the glands. This was made even more difficult because of the 2 big blisters in the way. I kept trying to force it back over and I put too much pressure on one of the blisters and it broke causing pus to leak out all over my penis and fingers. My sausage was on fire at this point and I was holding back tears but I kept pushing until I felt it pop back over the glands. Judging from the liquid that seeped out afterwards and the extra jolt of pain I felt I guess the second blister popped too. Once again I left it and went to bed. I checked 3 days later and my sausage went back to its original color. I rolled back the foreskin again and cleaned where the blisters were and within 3 weeks I was pretty much okay. My foreskin was still tight and I do think constricting my glands with the opening of my foreskin for a whole day probably made me lose a tiny bit of sensation down there but hey at least my schlong is clean now. Also please for the love of God teach your kids about their body. Even if they aren't as stupid as I was, don't take that risk.